Good to go? Good evening. I'm Yael Hungerford, and we're going to get started. If we could all quiet down a little bit. I'm Yael Hungerford, Executive Director of the Adam Smith Society, and I think they're saying the volume a little bit louder, Aaron. I'm very pleased to be welcoming you all here this evening, our audience here in the room and our members joining us via the live stream online. The Adam Smith Society is a mission-oriented community that joins together to discuss and debate the contributions of the free market to advancing human flourishing and opportunity for all. The free market and its relation to human flourishing is a central theme of the book we are here to discuss this evening, The Wall and the Bridge by Professor Hubbard, which
it's a great Oprah Winfrey moment.
Which examines the challenges of economic disruption. We are honored Professor Hubbard is here joining us this evening. Glenn Hubbard is the Russell L. Carson Professor of Finance and Economics at Columbia Business School, where he's also Dean Emeritus and the Director of the Jerome A. Chazen Institute for Global Business. From 2001 until 2003, he served as chairman of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors. In the corporate sector, he's on the boards of ADP, BlackRock, Fixed Income Funds, and MetLife, where he is chair. He's co-chair of the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation, a past chair of the Economic Club of New York, and a past co-chair of the Study Group on Corporate Boards. In addition to The Wall and the Bridge, he's the author of more than 100 scholarly articles in economics and finance, as well as 3 popular textbooks. His commentaries appear in top media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Financial Times. Welcome, Glenn. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
The subtitle of your book is Fear and Opportunity in Disruption's Wake. Can you start us off by explaining the nature of the disruption the book is concerned about?
Sure, but let me first start off by thanking you. This is my second Adam Smith talk today. Our students had their Adam Smith Society lunch, and I spoke at it. So I'm grateful to you and what Manhattan Institute does in New York. I was explaining to Yale when I first came to New York, other than Bill Buckley and National Review, I didn't really have anybody to talk to. And the Manhattan Institute has been a great treasure for New York. And I thank you for that as a conservative. To your question, imagine I had a coin in my hand. And the head side of the coin is what economists love to talk about and politicians too, and it's growth. It's our future, it's our living standard. There's a reason that Bob Lucas, when he got the Nobel Prize in economics, said, we go there because that's where the money is. The problem is the flip side of that same coin, the tails, is disruption. You cannot have, there's no modern theory of economic growth in which growth grows a little bit each year with no disruption to anybody. That's not how models work. It's not how the world works. And so growth and disruption are inextricably brought together. And that's the thesis of the book, because in the past several decades, 2 tectonic plates have shifted. One is about technological advance. It's the most important. The second, that's probably the most important to the public, but secondary to economists, is globalization. And those are the 2 tectonic plates that have shifted. They've disrupted lives, industries, firms, and communities. And so that's the fear and disruption. If you want to get at the political economy of what's going on, you can't simply take the neoliberal approach I was trained with and talk only about the head side of the coin. You got to talk about the tail side of the coin too. Hint, Adam Smith taught us how to do that, and that's what the book's about.
Great. Well, that's a good segue to my next question, which is that Adam Smith's arguments figure prominently in the book. Why do you think he is a helpful guide for addressing these challenges?
Well, for many reasons. First, as I try to explain to students, Smith was, and even today, I think he is considered a radical. If you think about when Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, and I'll come to what I think Smith thought his better book was in just a moment, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, but when Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, the prevailing ethos of the day was mercantilism, and everything was the sovereign and the welfare of the sovereign. Smith turns everything on his head, not from what today we would call economics, but from moral philosophy, and says, no, it's the ability of average people writ large to consume. Now, in modern economics, we've talked about, well, Smith must have meant the size of the pie and GDP and so on. I don't know whether he did or not, but that moral argument is compelling. But I really touch on Smith in the book as much as for The Wealth of Nations, for the theory of moral sentiments. Because in the theory of moral sentiments, Smith has this phrase, mutual sympathy, which I think in today's world we would call empathy. He wanted everybody in the boat. My colleague in the economics department, Ned Phelps, a Nobel laureate, refers to this as mass flourishing. That's what Smith wanted. And that's why Smith is really the touchstone of the book. The centerpiece of the wealth of nations is the concept of competition. What I argue in the book is if Smith were alive and with us today, he'd be talking about the ability to compete. And that's what the book's about.
So with the morality as the backdrop, it's common to want to erect walls to arrest economic disruption in the form, for example, of tariffs and subsidies. What's wrong with trying to protect American jobs and American industries?
Well, it's a good question. Let me start out first with the reason for the metaphor of the wall and the bridge. If you talk to politicians about what's going on in economic systems, and even many casual observers, they talk about it as a battle between capitalism and socialism. And I don't think that's what's going on. If you talk to most people who say they're interested in socialism, or at least not interested in capitalism, they don't mean socialism the way economists do. They just mean they'd like to smooth out wrinkles, if you will, of capitalism. What's really on offer in the political process are walls and bridges. And so walls are a metaphor for either the physical wall, let's say on the Mexican border, or walls against trade, against immigration, against new business processes and technology. That is very seductive. For a politician to be able to campaign, let's say in Youngstown, Ohio, which is a story I tell many times in the book, a politician to come in and say, I can make it 1955 again. I will bring back these jobs. That is so seductive. It is also so wrong. History is littered with examples of building walls. The counterpoint to the wall is not a neoliberal incantation of laissez-faire. It's bridges. It's going back to Smith of the moral sentiments. It's saying, let's go help people compete in the world today.
I guess I want to push you to say a little bit more about dynamism, about why you can't have a little bit of security, a little job protection.
Well, let me start with Warren Cass, who I think used to work here. Okay. So Warren Cass has this view that all economists since Adam Smith are all wet. And that's possible, but it's also possible, that something else is amiss. And I think Warren Cass has it exactly wrong. And the work that he represents has it exactly wrong, because it's this notion that you can put sand in the gears and still have much of the benefits of what Smith described. And that's really not true. The gains from openness require a lot of disruption. The problem economists had, and I think many politicians, is we minimize the pain of that disruption. I could tell by looking at you that economics was your favorite class in college. Just kind of look, and probably when you took Econ 101, the professor said there are gains from openness. He or she may have talked about gains from trade, gains from technological advance, but probably if you listen closely, the professor also said that people will lose too, but the trick is the gainers can compensate the losers. And so the trick in the arguments against protection is not to deny the impulse, because people will lose, but to say rather than trying to protect a particular job, or industry or firm, why don't we help people succeed in the world that it is? I mean, to give an example, many of the jobs that my students want didn't exist 30 years ago. So the whole notion that I'm going to establish a group of worthies in Washington to say manufacturing jobs, that's the jobs we should protect, or this job or that job, we don't know. I'm much more deferential to the market, but we can't simply say laissez-faire. We really have to help people. I think that's where economists fell down. It wasn't that Adam Smith got his logic wrong. We fell down on the implementation.
Now, in the book, you do identify cases where businesses have helped build bridges for employees in local communities. Eastman Kodak is one of the oldest examples.
Yep.
Can you share just a few of the stories you think were most successful
Sure.
with the audience?
I mean, first of all, for Eastman Kodak, it's hard to even pay sufficient attention to this point. George Eastman not only invented instamatic photography, he built Rochester. I mean, a lot of the cultural institutions, the employment. He was the anonymous Mr. Smith that built the beautiful MIT campus in Cambridge. George Eastman didn't do all of that because he thought he was being charitable or doing the Lord's work. He actually thought it was his responsibility as a business person. And I think part of what's missing in today's business community is the idea of that kind of responsibility. And I think many business people think that social support for the system is given. I don't see that. I mean, even among my students, Columbia Business School, great students, very smart. There's a lot of skepticism, if I'm honest with you, about business and the market system. So I think business leaders need to do better. Now, where have they done well? In the book, I talk about areas that have done well. So for example, I use as case studies the Pittsburgh's rebirth after the steel industry, the state of Massachusetts rebirth after textiles. I use as examples firms like Nucor. I took a group of students to Decatur, Alabama, to see that Nucor went there for all the usual reasons, taxes, regulation, but then found it didn't have a labor force that could match the skills it needed. So it had to roll up its sleeves. It worked with community leaders, community colleges, and so on. There are examples of doing this. And I'm not asking businesses to be charitable, although that's fine. I'm asking them to step outside and really build social support for what they do and build a relationship the same way George Eastman did with Rochester.
Given all the disruption because of globalization in the past 20 years, we didn't see very much of this, of businesses helping their workers transition to the new economy. Milton Friedman thought that what businesses would see would be in their interest to do this, and we didn't see that. Do you know why we didn't see that enough? And are there public policies we could adopt that would encourage that behavior more?
Yeah, good question. I mean, if you go back to Milton Friedman, I always like to talk to students about this because I really admire Milton Friedman's 1970 piece that's entitled something like A Social Responsibility of Businesses to Maximize Its Profits. It's a nice piece because once, like most economists, Milton wrote, if you understood his assumptions, the conclusions follow. So what Friedman had in mind was, let's assume a world that's perfectly competitive. So the product markets are competitive, the labor markets are competitive. Let's assume that government does its job, meaning it provides public goods at the optimal level and social insurance. If I write down all those assumptions, it almost ineluctably follows that if a company simply looks after its shareholders, it's done. I mean, why is that? Because if I don't treat workers well, if all markets are competitive, they'll just leave me to go work for somebody else. Now, embedded in that was there must be a self-interest of employers to look after their workers. But there are problems with that. So if I think about training workers more to be part of my firm, of course, they can also go work for your firm after I've spent the money to train them. That, however, is not an unsolvable problem. And in the real world, it means either having subsidies for training, just like we have subsidies for R&D, that has the same kind of spillover effects, or work with businesses to all band together and work, say, with local community colleges, as Toyota did in Kentucky with other firms. So there are ways to get around this. And I think for business leaders today, it's not just whether the job market is tight or not, but there's a moral responsibility and a social responsibility to help workers succeed in the firm.
So you suggest many public policies that can help build bridges. You just mentioned community college block grant or community colleges, and one of your suggestions is block grants for community colleges. Can you spell that out? What that would consist of, and specifically why that wouldn't interfere with the dynamism you explained is so necessary?
It's a great question. So one of the things people often ask me is there any time in American history where we did this well? And interestingly, one example, since I spend a lot of time these days talking to Republican politicians about ways they can reframe the way they speak, I take them back to the first Republican president, Lincoln. So I don't know how many of you have read Lowenstein's recent book about Lincoln's economic policy cabinet. What's fascinating is Lincoln wasn't just a great war president. The economic policies Lincoln was pursuing were the radical pursuit of opportunity. Lincoln was Adam Smith on steroids. And the piece I pick up that gets to community colleges is the land grant college movement. Lincoln's intuition was this had to be on the supply side. This wasn't, to take the parlance of our day, about free tuition. This was about building institutions and establishing capacity to help men and women. Land-grant colleges took many women students early on, succeed in a changed economy. Now, if you ask yourself, looking back, were the land-grant colleges a success? Yes, they absolutely were. Agricultural extension services, manufacturing extension services, preparing men and women for manufacturing, which was the hot new thing of that day that Lincoln had seen. Ask yourself today, which institutions in our educational system are preparing men and women for the mid-skilled jobs of the future and retraining men and women who fall out of the boat? It's community colleges. The problem is, ask yourself what politicians want to do with community colleges. First, in most states, their budgets have been cut relative to four-year colleges. And where we do hear discussions of assistance, it's more the free tuition mantra. Let me make sure it doesn't cost you money to go to community college. But of course, that doesn't provide a nickel's worth of resources to community college. That's what Lincoln understood in setting up the land-grant colleges. Austin Goolsbee, who is a friend, a Democratic economist, and I did this idea of a block grant for community colleges. It's more complicated because it's linked to performance, but let's just think of it as a flexible block grant built on the land-grant college model that would give community colleges the resources to give America by 2030 the skills and education that experts say is required. So I think it's absolutely critical. When we first came up with it, put all the tight revenue estimates around it, we thought over 10 years it might cost between $250 billion and $300 billion. And I remember shopping it to Hank Paulson and Erskine Bowles, who were running a Aspen Institute group that Austin and I were in. And both of them thought we were insane. I mean, Hank said, "Are you smoking French bread? I mean, who's going to spend $250 billion on community colleges?" Joe Biden spent $400 billion, if courts say it's okay, in the stroke of a pen for student loan forgiveness. So what we need to do is think smart on the supply side. So community colleges are absolutely critical, and they build on the land-grant college intuition of Lincoln.
Is there something about them that gives them, are they in a privileged position to understand what the jobs of the future are going to be?
Yes, for two reasons. One, they are more aimed at skill training than universities like mine. They also operate in local areas. So it's not at all uncommon to see a community college partner with large employers in the area to provide jobs that employer is willing to provide. So it's a much tighter linkage. It's easier to imagine going to a community college and understanding you will be trained for a job in that area or retrained if you've fallen out of the boat. So they're absolutely essential. They're the unsung heroes of the transition.
You also suggest place-based block grants. And this was maybe one of the more controversial ones, in my opinion, because my understanding is that free market economists want dynamism, and that means having people move to where the jobs are, not entrenching communities where all the jobs have dried up. So can you explain?
Well, I came to this one very slowly because my intuition would have been exactly what you said. So, think back to Horace Greeley of "Go West, young man." Go wherever the opportunities are. And if you're in Youngstown, Ohio, and the jobs aren't there, well, maybe you should go to Nashville or Orlando. That's how my intuition was shaped. If you look at mobility data, though, geographical mobility data, you find it's not happening. And that's true for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's just uncertainty about if I make the leap, is it really there? I'm giving up a social welfare system. I'm giving up culture, community, family. For many different reasons, it's not happening. There are ways to do place-based aid that can encourage business and growth. And one example of that are proposals that Ed Glazer, who I know is affiliated here at MI, has proposed of doing, very targeted business-oriented block grants that are flexible. Just like the land-grant colleges or the community colleges, that has the advantage of not having a one-size-fits-all model in Washington that says we're going to subsidize this activity or this industry. It's going to places where structural unemployment rates have been very high, and asking what's the problem there and what a block grant can fix. So I think it's a big part of the problem. If you think about the metaphor I use in the book is Youngstown, Ohio, where I've taken many sets of students. And if you think about the places like Youngstown, they are suffering because they realize that the rest of the nation has kind of forgotten them. And I think the place-based aid model can bridge that gap.
I have one last question before we open up the floor to questions from the audience. In the book, you recommend a program of national service. Can you share with us what you have in mind and how such a program can be a solution?
It's an interesting story because I was giving a talk on, the first thing I wrote on this was an article in National Affairs, also called The Wall and the Bridge, that Yuval Levin had asked me to do. And I gave it at a conference at Yale. And we were having a dinner after the conference, and Bob Shiller, who's a Nobel Prize winner economist, personal friend, we were talking about the difference between the World War II generation of people maybe a little older than my parents and current generations, and the idea that that generation, because of the war, because of depression, felt much more solidarity. And then Bob let it stand. He said, so that's what we need. And I said, so Bob, are you saying that we need World War III to rebuild solidarity? And I got to thinking when I went back to the hotel that night that national service provides some of that. When you think about part of the problem in the country, it's a lack of noticing by elites, whether they're economic elites or politicians or even, dare I say it, economists, who just don't understand. And national service brings people together across backgrounds, across economic classes and social classes, and throws them together. I think there's much to recommend it. There are a number of thoughtful people like Bell Sawhill and others who thought about how to do this, but I think that it's something very much to consider.
The implication there that there are some elites that are unfamiliar with how Americans...
Totally. When I speak to CEOs, one of my common things is to ask them how you grew up. And invariably, they'll answer the way I would answer that question. I grew up in a lower middle income family in the rural part of the country. They'll have similar stories. And then I ask them, so how'd your kids grow up? Totally different, in a bubble. And I ask, how do you live your life? Do you see other people other than people who directly interact with you professionally? And they don't. You can't notice if you don't look. And I think this was part of the problem. If you ask, even the question of what happened in things like the financial crisis, it was because people weren't looking, weren't noticing. And when you have structural problems like this, it's really incumbent upon people leading business institutions or political institutions or even educational institutions to get out and notice.
Great. Great, so let's turn to questions from the audience. Anyone in the room, please raise your hand. Miles Sinagra is going to be walking around with the microphone. Before you ask a question, please introduce yourself. And all of our members watching online can submit questions via Slido, and we have people who can read them out for us in the room. So Miles, let's go to Manali first.
Hi, I'm Manali Derekshani. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in physics at Rutgers. I was curious to what extent your proposed solutions for helping people who fall off the boat, so to speak, are motivated by political limitations, political realities, as opposed to your ideal solution as a proponent of free markets. So for example, it seems to me that a more free market-oriented approach to helping such people would involve substantially cutting regulations, lowering tax rates, opening up the supply of housing by rolling back zoning laws, a lot of things you could do. So yeah, I guess that's my question.
Well, I'm for all of that, but it won't really fix these problems. So first of all, the issues you mentioned, some of those are federal issues, some of those are state issues. There's a policy discussion that's really hard. But even if we did all of those things, the pressures of technological advance and globalization would have left many people aside. To slip into econ speak a minute, the part of the problem is the way we've designed social insurance is to be about the business cycle. And in fact, the problems of the modern world are structural and they need a different kind of social insurance. So I agree with everything you said. I'm for all of that, and we should do all of that, but it's not going to be enough. And I think part of why some conservatives sound a little hollow is by saying, well, if we just do that, the problem is done, and I don't buy that. But it is necessary, it's just not sufficient, I guess is what I should say.
Right over here.
Hi there. I'm Casey Given, Executive Director of Young Voices. I'm interested in your comments about kind of the social responsibility of businesses, because I feel like a lot of businesses would actually acknowledge it, at the very least, the big ones, that they do have a social responsibility. We've seen this with like the Business Roundtable and kind of moving on beyond the Milton Friedman type thinking about that the role of a corporation is just to maximize profits, particularly with things concerns like stakeholder capitalism, ESG, et cetera. So do you think the problem is that businesses, big business, just don't have their eye on the prize and they're distracted by concerns like diversity, et cetera, rather than addressing globalization? Is that really something that's just their priorities are wrong?
Well, I worry about stakeholder capitalism, the way you use that term, because to go back to Friedman's original argument, saying that you should focus on your shareholders, Friedman did not mean by that you were expropriating money from others. If you buy the assumptions that I outlined in my remarks, Friedman's argument is completely right. I worry that if business leaders are free to pursue too many objectives, it's hard to hold them accountable. So if I fail today, I say, well, I failed you, the shareholder, but that's because I was helping workers today, or I was helping communities tomorrow. So we really have to have clear accountability for business. That's what worries me about some of the ESG metrics and stakeholder metrics. I think if you look at what the BRT did in its statement on the purpose of the corporation, it said nice things, but I'm not sure how different it really is from what they're already doing. To me, the social issues for business are not because I want business to give more money to the opera or parks or something like that, but to really realize they come from society. And that means if you want social support, you have to be part of a community. That's really what I'm asking for. I think Friedman, in a sense, if you go back and read his New York Times piece, almost literally said the same thing. He talked about the value of being involved in communities and giving in communities.
But the point I think you're making is also that just their priorities seem to be different than what current BRT priorities or different than what you think they should be.
I think so, but it's hard to know what the BRT priorities really mean. I mean, they signed the statement, but it's hard to know what it means. If you look at studies of ESG and performance, they're really all over the map. I mean, to be honest, and the modal result is probably 0 to negative. So I don't think that this is the slam dunk that it's being sold. At least that's one person's view.
Thomas, did you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Thomas. I'm a scientist at Regeneron. My question is about your talk about community colleges, and it sounds like you present data on how community colleges have performed in the past, while then making recommendations that we should fund them more. And I just wonder, to what extent funding them more or funding people who go to community colleges would make them not recognize that cost and decrease the benefit that they're getting out of it. Maybe those employers that partner with those institutions, they wouldn't have an incentive to do so because that they're getting the money from the government essentially, rather than from students making their decisions based on a cost benefit analysis of what they're going to get from that institution.
It's a great question. What Austin and I were suggesting was, again, supply side funding. So we're not funding tuition or giving individuals money. It's standing up the ability of community colleges to help people graduate. So a dirty little secret of community colleges is they do lousy, actually, historically, at graduation, at getting people to complete. And when we look at returns to whether it's four-year college or two-year college, it's not whether you go to college, it's whether you graduate from college. And there are a number of interventions that can help that work. And that's really what these block grants are aiming at. Now, if you're asking, why can't the private sector do that? Honestly, it could. For example, a lot of the programs that Austin and I talk about, we learned about because a mutual friend of ours, Penny Pritzker, is paying for those in Chicago. And we met with the head of the Chicago Community College. So it is possible for private philanthropy to do a lot of this. At scale in the country, though, probably not. But absolutely, private business can be doing this.
In the back.
Hey, thanks for coming. My name is Evan. The concepts around empowering and educating young people and people who are entering the workforce seems really clear. What is your perspective on the folks who are structurally unemployed at this point, the Rust Belt, folks who may have had jobs in automotive or whatever sector that's just been kind of gobbled up by global firms?
It's a great question. And two of the ideas I talk about are aimed at that. One is place-based aid that you asked me about. The other is something we didn't talk about up here, but I mentioned in the book of partial wage insurance for older workers. So if you're talking about somebody who's 25 and that person is preparing for the future, well, everything I've talked about sort of flows. But if you talk about somebody, let's say, who's 55 and who's played by a different set of rules, he or she may not have the same runway or incentive to complete. And so wage insurance, which is basically, think of it as a variant of what we call in this country the earned income tax credit, but for older displaced workers, sort of topping up their wages, may be a necessary social intervention. Because if you look at a lot of the political angst, it does come from what I would call middle-aged workers who felt like they were playing by one set of rules, and then the rules changed. And part of the problem I think we as conservatives sometimes have is we think people are just lacking agency to deal with it. And that may be true for some people. But I think a lot of it is we're asking people to bear macro risks. And how many of us in this room can bear macro risks successfully? It's pretty hard, right? So I think that we do have to consider ideas that we might have thought radical a few years ago.
Sean, do you have a question from online?
Yeah, we have a question from the person on virtual call.
The fragility of the supply chain became apparent during the pandemic. Aren't there national security reasons to nationalize the production of key items like microchips?
Oh, I get asked this every time. Yes, but, right? So yes, anytime you can say the word national security, particularly somebody like me who's not a national security expert, obviously if there's a clear national security interest, we should follow that. Smith said that in The Wealth of Nations. That's hardly a departure from classical liberalism. The reason I said yes, but I don't think the Trump tariffs had a legitimate national security argument against crazy countries like Canada and things like that. So I think we have to be very, very careful about what we mean by national security. And I worry if we start using those words, it becomes a slippery slope. Rather, I'd like to see us think about what are the things we could do in our own economy to improve things. That could mean strengthening our basic research and supply chains. It could be in material sciences and things that we could be doing. I don't think we want to just use the national security word for protectionism.
Over here.
Thanks. John Stone, Near Earth Capital. A lot of the proposals that you put out do require resources.
Yep.
And AKA money. And a obvious source of funding for some of these to me seems to be tariffs. Because it's basically putting the cost on where the damage is being done. Basically, almost like taxing polluters for the externality that they would otherwise create. And then there's the issue also. I always thought that it was preferable that I would have to pay a slightly higher price for goods because they were protected by tariffs, rather than to pay slightly higher taxes to have the people who would otherwise be making those goods do nothing at all and be on the dole. So let me just put that out there. And I'd
You
love to
threw
hear
a
your
lot out
comments.
there. Let me try to take it in pieces. So I'm certainly not suggesting putting anyone on the dole. So the thesis of the book is if the world has changed for an economy, you need to help people change because of the dignity of work. So no dole from me. The tariff argument is just 100% wrong. Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations exactly to talk to you about that. The thesis of The Wealth of Nations is that the mercantilist approach of tariffs and thinking of money going out of the country as bad and externalities, that's wrong. That was the whole purpose of the Wealth of Nations. That said, you're 100% right that there are big dislocation effects. Those do take resources. If you added up everything that I talked about in the book, much of what I talked about tonight, the price is probably between 70 and $100 billion a year. When I wrote the book, I thought that was real money. Once I've watched the current administration, I realized I was talking about dinner tips or something like that. But it is real money, and I actually outline how to pay for it in terms of spending reductions and some small changes in the corporate tax as well. But I don't think tariffs are the answer for the same reason Smith would have said no.
In the back of the room, good question.
Hi, I'm Ren. Thank you for coming. My question is, do you think that in 10, 20 years, there will actually be a middle tier of jobs that are available for Americans to do? Let's say that we actually subsidize community colleges and they have new technology programs. You upskill all these people, but they're still going to be more expensive than a programmer in India, say, or the Philippines. And a lot of white collar jobs that are currently done in the US could probably be outsourced, and now we have remote work. So even if you do all this upskilling, can we guarantee that there are actually going to be jobs waiting for people when they come out?
I can't guarantee anything. But what I can say is that wage levels in the rest of the world are rising as well. And there's more than just programming jobs in life. And so if you think about when I was talking about community colleges, I talked about mid-skilled jobs. When I was a kid, they might have been called trades. But those are important and solidly middle income jobs. They are in today's economy, and there are too few people in them. So I think there are many potential jobs that will be available. The question is, do we have the system that's ready to train them? Will it be easy? No. Will we need to help some people with wage supports? Yes. Whether that's wage insurance for older Americans or the earned income tax credit for young Americans, we probably need to do that if we believe in work, as I do. So I can't guarantee you anything in the future, but nothing tells me it's impossible.
As a follow-up, in the book, you mentioned that you don't think HAL's coming for everyone's jobs.
No.
As in, artificial intelligence is not going to put everyone out of work. Can you defend that?
Yeah, well, I certainly hope it doesn't put economics professors out of work. That's my first order concern. But no, I think there are a lot of jobs that do require interaction or manual skill. What AI is going to do is continue to disrupt what I would call the middle tier of information jobs. It'll make the most successful people all the more productive. The middle tier is the problem, to the point of the question. Those are going to be different kinds of jobs, but I don't think AI is going to do all jobs. It will be a very important general purpose technology. We know general purpose technologies change a lot, but I don't think it's taking all our jobs.
We've got right over here, and then second question over there.
Hello, James Eacock, NYCHA. Do you think that onshoring could be a solution to much of what we're talking about, bringing the supply chains back to the United States? You know, as we learned during the pandemic, it's probably better if we're building more things here.
Very good question. I think businesses are getting there largely on their own through market forces. And so I think businesses have realized that their global supply chains may not be as resilient as they wanted. They understand that, and they're moving them back on shore. Yale mentioned I was on the board of ADP. I'm actually not anymore. I switched to Total, which is a big energy company. But when I was on the board of ADP, I encouraged them to do something they have done, which is do what was called several years ago smart shore. So we put a lot of jobs in El Paso, Texas, and Augusta, Georgia, as opposed to the Philippines and India. And I felt it was more efficient for ADP, and it hasn't really cost that much more money to do that. But businesses can figure that on their own. So ADP didn't make that decision out of a social concern. It did it because it made good business sense. So I think that's largely going to happen.
Just a
quick
follow-up. And then
You could use the microphone
thank you.
for the mic.
If our own citizens then have these jobs, yes, they'll be getting paid higher wages and that could contribute to inflation. But is that, the social benefit? I think, to me, it's worth it.
It's 100% social benefit, and it's not contributing to inflation. Inflation would be excess demand relative to the supply. Adding to the productive supply of the economy is not inflationary. Something I said? Yikes.
Not sure. Maybe someone who knows. I'm sure Aaron can help us with this at some point. But I think there was another question over here. Microphone could be passed down.
Hi, I'm Ari. Thank you for being here. My question is largely about non-market economies and how to deal with them. I imagine from what I've heard tonight, the theory is non-market economies are going to, and the entire idea behind, zero tariffs, I'm assuming includes kind of anti-dumping duties, countervailing subsidies. So my question is the theory that they're going to take what we don't want, we need to be ahead of the curve and develop new things that when the non-market economies kind of drain our skill set, then we develop into something new. And the question is, industry alone is going to be hard pressed to do that. So it was kind of interesting. Who do we leave that to figuring out what's next? And then wouldn't the market economies continue playing catch up constantly?
That's a great question. I would take it in parts. Government still has a role to play. If you think about the jobs of the future and what we want, we're going to have much more innovation requirement, which means R&D and basic research. Basic research is classic spillover externality program. There has to be a big role for government. I don't think we can say we just want open markets all the time, everywhere. That was the question, I guess, that was asked from the audience on live stream. For example, I think it's an open question whether China belongs in the WTO at all. I count myself among the people who should be blamed for putting them there because I pushed Bush really hard on that. And I'm sure Clinton's advisors did too. But I have to look and say, I don't think it's abiding by the rules that we set. So there may be different rules. There may be some things in which we cooperate and others that we don't. But to your question about where will the jobs of the future come from, obviously mainly from the energies and entrepreneurial energy of business people, but government does have a role to play. You can't just stand aside. It is about basic research, and as I argue in the book, about applied research centers as well.
Brandon. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Whatever hand was up. Yep.
Hi, my name is Dylan Donalfo. So you talked a lot from an academic perspective on the role of community college, and that being a way to address some of the concerns structurally and from a skills perspective. But what about traditional higher academic institutions? Do you think they're well positioned? And if not, how do we make the cost benefit analysis better for people so that, we're talking about debt or just making sure that they have the proper skills for, the next economy?
Great question. I guess it depends, well positioned for what. So Columbia, where I teach, we're not the problem or the solution for what I'm talking about. However, there's much that we and other universities, four-year universities, can do. I don't think we're well positioned to solve the problems of structural change, but I do think we are well positioned to make sure people have the ability to think about the skills that will be required for tomorrow. If your question was broader about is higher ed efficient? No, it's not even close. And part of that is, people aren't seeing the real cost of what they're doing. I think higher ed is one of the least efficient. Having run a big part of a major university, I can attest to you how inefficient it is and how many institutions, I probably shouldn't say this because there are alumni in the room, and I do want you to give to the university, but how many times, could I sit with somebody and just say, write me a check, and they would just do it? So that's no way to become efficient. So if that was your question, we're not good at it, but we're not the problem or the solution for what I'm talking about.
We have a question from our virtual audience again.
One of the concerns Oren Cass and others have raised is that economists and politicians have focused on consumption over production. Do you have any thoughts on the way we prioritize these two sides of the coin?
Yeah, I think that Smith was right. So Smith said, really, the standard of living is the consumption of the nation, of average people. And again, the reason that was so radical was the system was supposed to have benefited the sovereign for war, for luxury consumption, whatever the sovereign wanted. Smith turns that on its head. The problem with saying production is it presumes you know what the efficient mix of production is. Just like I said, jobs my students want didn't exist 30 years ago. I'm not bold enough to sit here today and tell you who the leading companies or industries are going to be 30 years from now. I could guess, you could guess, but that's all we would be doing. So no, consumption is still the right thing to do. That said, we do want to train people for the jobs of the future.
I think I saw one hand from Sam. You can call this the last question here.
Hi, Sam Blackman. Thank you very much. So you made a comment about how the business leaders and George Eastman and that's at 1800s, 1880s, they had a responsibility. They felt a responsibility. And I'm wondering what your comment would be to the idea that business leaders felt that need because there was less government involvement in social programs at the time as there exists today. So today, you're a business leader, you sort of don't even, it doesn't matter because it's already existing. Just your comment on that. Thank you.
It's an excellent question. I'm not sure I have a perfect answer for it, but what I'm talking about is not business responsibility and social insurance, which is principally what government does, but more in things like training, community revitalization, and so on. So I'll give you a very practical example. I chair the board of MetLife. So I do think hard about what we do. And I've pushed our CEO really hard on training in communities, not because I'm against government or not because I think MetLife has a charitable responsibility, but I think it's really in part of building our social prominence as a firm, especially in a regulated industry. So I think if businesses think about it, there's still those opportunities, even with a large state today that's larger than Eastman.
Please join me in thanking Professor Hubbard
Thank you.
for being with us here today. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We are grateful you're part of our mission-oriented community. If this is anyone's first Adam Smith Society Young Leaders event, please come see me or the program officers in the room. We've got Miles, Sean, and Joe. We'd love to keep you more involved, get you more involved in the community. And please know the formal program is ending, but the room is not closing. Please stay, hang out. The bar will be open until 8:30, and Professor Hubbard can stay a bit to sign copies of the book. So thanks, everyone.